A door to the Ice Age has been sitting open this whole time, 37 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, and almost nobody on Earth has ever been allowed to walk through it. Not because it's hidden behind rubble or buried under sand, but because reaching it means swimming through a pitch-black tunnel longer than a football field and a half, with no light, no oxygen, and no way back if something goes wrong. What's waiting at the end of that tunnel isn't just old. It's a gallery of paintings that shouldn't exist according to everything scientists thought they knew about Ice Age art, painted by people who saw an ocean that no longer exists, on a coastline that hasn't been dry land in 9,000 years. This is the story of Cosquer Cave, and it starts with a man who wasn't looking for history at all. In the summer of 1985, a diving instructor named Henri Cosquer was exploring the limestone cliffs of the Calanques, the dramatic inlets carved into the coast between Marseille and Cassis in the south of France. He knew these waters well. He'd spent years diving around Cap Morjou, one of the most striking points along that stretch of coastline, and he wasn't hunting for anything in particular that day. At a depth of around 37 meters, roughly 121 feet, something caught his eye. A narrow opening in the rock face, barely wide enough to notice unless you were paying attention. Most divers would have swum past it. Cosquer didn't. He followed the opening inward and found himself in a tight, flooded passage that kept going and going. The tunnel stretched for about 175 meters, close to 570 feet, sloping gradually upward into total darkness. He didn't push all the way through that first day. Instead, over the next several years, he kept coming back on his own, extending his knowledge of the passage a little further with each dive, laying guideline as he went so he could find his way out again. This wasn't a funded expedition or an academic project. It was one man's private curiosity, pursued almost entirely alone, at a depth and in conditions where a single equipment failure could be fatal. And at least once, it very nearly was. During one solo dive deep inside the passage, Cosquer's lamp failed. He was forced to retreat through total darkness with no clear sense of how much further he had to swim before reaching open water. He later admitted the experience shook him badly, enough to make him reconsider how far he could reasonably keep pushing this exploration by himself. Cave diving is already one of the most dangerous activities a diver can attempt, because unlike open water, there's no straight line to the surface. You can only go back the way you came. Losing your light source in a flooded tunnel 100 meters from daylight is the kind of moment that ends careers, and sometimes lives. By 1990, Cosquer recognized that the passage had become too long and too risky to keep exploring solo. That decision brought outside help into the project for the first time. He recruited two Belgian cave diving brothers, Bernard and Mark van Espen, to help push the guideline further into the tunnel. Following Cosquer's directions, the brothers moved carefully to avoid disturbing the fine silt coating the tunnel floor, because in a passage that narrow, stirred-up sediment can turn clear water into an opaque, disorienting soup within seconds, trapping a diver in a space they can no longer see through. Their caution paid off. They eventually reached an underground lake with a pocket of trapped air sitting above the waterline, a strong hint that dry, unflooded space existed somewhere beyond it. But their guideline ran out before they could confirm what was there, and they had to turn back. The mystery held for almost another year. In June of 1991, Mark van Espen returned and laid the final stretch of line needed to safely reach whatever sat beyond the flooded section. That dive only explored the first chamber, but it proved something important. The dry space was real, and it could be reached. A few weeks later, Cosquer went back one more time, and this dive is the one that changed everything. On July 9th, 1991, he returned with his niece, Sandrine Cosquer, along with two friends, Jan Goguen and Pascal Auriol. This time, the group pushed further into the dry chambers than anyone ever had, and they got their first real look at a space that had been sealed off from the outside world since the end of the last ice age. Cosquer's own reaction, by his own account, wasn't wonder. It was suspicion. When he first saw markings on the walls, his immediate thought was that someone had broken in and spray-painted graffiti. The idea that genuine prehistoric art could be sitting inside a chamber accessible only by scuba gear seemed almost too strange to take seriously. It took time for the realization to sink in, for him and the others, that what they were looking at wasn't recent vandalism at all, but paintings and engravings that had sat completely undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. That moment should have been the triumphant center of the story. Instead, tragedy arrived within weeks, and it was that tragedy, not the discovery itself, that finally forced the cave into public view. In September 1991, 3 divers from Grenoble, having heard informal word of the discovery circulating through the local diving community, attempted to explore the same underwater passage on their own. They got lost in the tunnel and never made it out. Cosquer and Jan Goguen took part in the grim task of helping recover their bodies from the passage, and after that, keeping the cave's existence private was no longer an option. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1991, Cosquer formally reported the site to France's Maritime Affairs Department in Marseille. The report set off an official chain of command, and the discovery was quickly handed to the Regional Archaeological Service under the Ministry of Culture. What had spent 6 years as one diver's personal secret became, almost overnight, a matter for the French state. A discovery arriving on the back of a fatal accident needed serious, careful verification before anyone could trust what was actually being described. And finding someone qualified to do that verification turned out to be a problem all its own, because confirming the paintings were genuine required an expert capable of personally diving to them. Almost no archaeologist specializing in the Paleolithic period had the technical cave diving skill to reach a chamber 37 meters underwater through a narrow, flooded tunnel. Authorities eventually turned to Jean Courtin, an archaeologist whose expertise leaned closer to the Neolithic period, simply because he was one of the only qualified researchers physically capable of making the dive. From September 18th to 20th, 1991, an expedition led by Courtin, joined by cave art specialist Jean Klotz, traveled out aboard a research vessel to examine the site directly. Klotz himself wasn't even a diver at that point. He'd first heard about the cave through Cosquer's photographs while working at the Ministry of Culture, and he found them compelling enough that he learned to scuba dive at 69 years old specifically so he could study the cave in person. He went on to make dozens of trips out to the site over the following years, frequently battling rough seas and canceled dives just to get a few hours in the chamber. Courtin authenticated the site in 1991, confirming that the paintings and engravings were genuinely ancient rather than an elaborate hoax staged inside a nearly inaccessible cave. That confirmation didn't end the questions. If anything, it opened a much bigger one. How does an Ice Age art gallery end up sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea? Before getting to that answer, it's worth pausing on the skepticism that nearly buried this to every single one discovered before Cosquer's find sat west of the Rhone River. Nobody had ever found anything like this east of the Rhone in the Provence region, and that geographic anomaly alone was enough to make several prehistorians publicly doubt the paintings were authentic. The skepticism grew louder once specific details of the artwork reached the press. Critics pointed to what looked like a penguin, an animal nobody expected in French Ice Age art, hand stencils, that appeared to be missing fingers, and the oddly convenient detail that the lower edge of several painted horses lined up almost exactly with the cave's current waterline, as if someone modern had painted them with today's sea level in mind. Some of this played out publicly in the Spanish press, where questions were raised about whether the entire site might be a forgery. Spanish prehistorian Antonio Beltran pushed back, pointing out that while he personally hadn't seen penguin-like imagery in cave art before, other genuinely rare animals, like snow hares, had shown up in verified prehistoric sites elsewhere. An unusual species alone wasn't enough to dismiss a whole cave. The doubts didn't survive contact with the evidence. Once excavation and conservation campaigns got fully underway in 1992 and 1994, led by Klotz alongside a growing team of specialists, the accumulating physical evidence closed the forgery theory for good, and it also finally explained how a cave sitting deep underwater today ever held open-air paintings in the first place. During the last glacial period, the world along this coastline looked nothing like it does now. Sea levels sat somewhere between 100 and 120 meters lower than today, because enormous volumes of the planet's water were locked away in glaciers and polar ice sheets. The cave itself sat roughly 6 kilometers inland, overlooking an open, steppe-like landscape rather than any ocean at all. Around 10,000 years ago, as the world warmed into the period known as the Holocene, glaciers began melting rapidly and sea levels climbed across the globe. The Mediterranean coastline crept steadily inland over thousands of years until it swallowed the valley in front of the cave entirely, then kept rising until it submerged the entrance itself, cutting off any dry access by roughly 9,000 years ago. Nobody sealed this cave on purpose. It was drowned slowly by a changing planet, closed off behind a wall of seawater instead of collapsed stone. That kind of natural seal is almost impossible to fake. But proving the actual age of the paintings still required hard, verifiable science, and the process wasn't smooth at first. When early age estimates for the cave were announced, some researchers balked because the numbers being proposed sounded too old to accept without direct confirmation. Radiocarbon dating on material. This ancient is difficult, but not impossible, and researchers eventually built an airtight case using several independent lines of evidence. The clearest physical proof came from thin layers of calcite, a mineral that forms gradually on rock surfaces over long stretches of time, found growing directly on top of several paintings. That kind of mineral crust simply doesn't form in a matter of decades, which meant any painting sitting beneath a calcite layer had to be genuinely ancient. In 1998, researchers strengthened the case, further with fragments of wood and pollen recovered from the site that lined up with the same time period. Eventually, Jean Claudes and Jean Courtin collected 27 separate radiocarbon dates from the cave, and the results clustered into two distinct groups. one centered around 27,000 years ago and another around 19,000 years ago. That two-phase pattern meant the cave wasn't decorated in a single visit by a single group of people. Later research expanded that picture considerably. Between 1992 and 2012, researchers ran around 60 separate radiocarbon tests on 41 different samples collected from the site, confirming a long span of human visits stretching from roughly 33,000 years ago down to about 19,000 years ago, arranged into two major, largely separate phases of occupation. That timeline places the cave's earliest visitors around the same era as the last people using the famous Chauvet Cave further north, while its final visitors overlapped with the artists working at Lascaux. The two phases also line up with two distinct prehistoric cultures. Archaeologists attribute the earlier visits and most of the cave's hand stencils to the Gravettian culture active across Europe roughly 27,000 years ago. The later visits belong to the Solutrean culture, active around 19,000 years ago and known elsewhere in Europe for real technical leaps in tool making, including fitting stone blades onto wooden handles carved from pine and birch. That same Solutrean period is also when the famous carved Venus figurines start appearing at other European sites, which means the artists who returned to paint over Cosquer's older Gravettian handprints were working with noticeably more advanced tools than the people who had stood in that same chamber 8,000 years earlier. That raises an obvious question. Who were these people, and why does so much of what they painted look nothing like French cave art anywhere else? Most of France's famous decorated caves, Lascaux and Chauvet included, are covered in horses, bison, mammoths, and other animals of the open plains and forests. Cosquer's walls tell a completely different story. Alongside horses, ibex, chamois, and an extinct giant deer called the megaloceros. The cave contains dozens of images of seals, along with birds that most people who see them immediately describe as penguins. The full inventory of imagery inside the cave now stands at roughly 500 individual paintings and engravings, representing at least 11 different species, including a cave lion and a saiga antelope, both animals long vanished from the Mediterranean region, alongside around 200 separate geometric signs scattered across the walls. Those birds almost certainly aren't true penguins, because penguins have never existed anywhere in the northern hemisphere. Researchers now believe the artists were depicting the great auk, a large flightless seabird that once thrived across the North Atlantic and looked remarkably similar to a small penguin, with a black and white body built for swimming rather than flight. The great auk went extinct in the 1800s, hunted out of existence long after these paintings were made, which makes Cosquer Cave one of the only places on Earth where you can see one preserved in ochre and charcoal. Some of the cave's markings are also thought by certain researchers to depict jellyfish or octopuses, adding even more marine subject matter to a gallery that, by every other example from this period, should have stayed firmly on dry land. It makes more sense once you remember the cave's original setting, perched above what was once an Ice Age coastline rather than sitting far inland. The most striking single feature inside the cave sits deep past the point where the flooded tunnel finally opens into dry ground. There, the ceiling rises to a full 30 meters in the final chamber, a space large enough that early explorers needed real time just to take in its scale. Along one stretch of wall is what researchers call the panel of horses, a dense concentration of imagery containing 63 individual horse figures, making it one of the largest single collections of horses found in any decorated cave in France. Nearby sit the cave's engraved crosses, simple geometric marks cut directly into the stone rather than painted, whose exact purpose is still unclear. Whether they functioned as counting marks, territorial signals, or something tied to belief systems now completely lost to history isn't something the physical evidence alone can settle. The floor of the dry chambers has preserved its own quiet record of the people who once stood there. Thanks to the cave's near-total isolation from later human activity, archaeologists have recovered charcoal from old fires and torches, along with a small number of flint tools scattered across the ground. One particularly notable find is a calcite plaque measuring roughly 22 centimeters long that researchers believe was used as a lamp, likely holding burning fat or oil to light the way through chambers that would otherwise have been in complete darkness. These floor deposits matter almost as much as the wall art itself, because burned material like torch charcoal can be radiocarbon dated directly, giving researchers centimeters long that researchers believe was used as a lamp, likely holding burning fat or oil to light the way through chambers that would otherwise have been in complete darkness. These floor deposits matter almost as much as the wall art itself, because burned material like torch charcoal can be radiocarbon dated directly, giving researchers an independent way to confirm the timeline drawn from the paintings above. A lamp, a scattering of tools, and the remains of old fires paint a picture of real people moving carefully through unfamiliar dark passages, doing exactly what anyone exploring a cave without modern lighting would need to do just to see where they were going. That same picture of careful, repeated visits is what makes the cave's most debated features so difficult to fully explain. Among the earliest artwork inside the cave are dozens of hand stencils, made by pressing a hand flat against the rock and blowing pigment around it to leave a ghostly outline behind. Estimates of the total number vary depending on the source, with official French heritage records citing 55 negative hand stencils alongside extensive finger markings, while other researchers have counted closer to 65 individual stencils made in both red and black pigment. A striking number of them appear to be missing one or more fingers. Thumbs are almost always shown fully intact, while the other fingers are the ones that disappear. The same pattern shows up at other caves too, and researchers now recognize it as a recurring feature specifically tied to the Gravettian culture across large parts of Europe during this period. At Gargas, in the French Pyrenees, more than 100 of the over 200 recorded hand stencils are missing digits. At Maltraveso in Spain, the majority of the hand images show the same pattern. Researchers have proposed several competing explanations, and none of them has settled the debate. Some argue the fingers were simply bent down out of view, similar to folding your fingers to make a shadow puppet. Others point to frostbite, since the specific pattern of loss, sparing the thumb while shortening the others, closely resembles how frostbite actually damages human hands in extreme cold. A related theory suggests the missing fingers formed a deliberate signaling system, an early form of hand-based communication in which different combinations carried specific meanings understood within the community, though this remains speculative. A smaller number of researchers have argued for deliberate ritual mutilation, though other specialists consider that unlikely, since losing multiple fingers on purpose would have posed a serious survival risk for people who depended on their hands for hunting and toolmaking. Nobody has settled which explanation is correct, and that uncertainty makes these hands one of the most argued over details in all of Paleolithic art. They aren't the only unusual human trace on these walls either. Cave art from this period almost never shows recognizable human figures. Painters overwhelmingly chose animals, geometric signs, and hand stencils, leaving full human bodies out of the picture across nearly every major site in Europe. Cosquer breaks that pattern with two unusual engravings. One shows a figure combining the lower body of a seal with the upper body of a man. The other, even more striking, shows a human figure that appears to have been struck by a spear or similar weapon, described by researchers who studied it as an image resembling a killed or wounded man. Nobody knows what story either image was meant to tell. It could represent a hunting accident, a symbolic warning, a ritual scene, or something tied to belief systems that left no written or spoken record behind. What's certain is that both images are exceptionally rare subjects for this entire era of art, and their presence adds yet another layer to a cave that keeps breaking the standard pattern of what Ice Age painters usually chose to create. As remarkable as the surviving artwork is, a significant portion of what once decorated this cave is already gone for good. And the reason ties directly back to the same rising sea that hid the entrance in the first place. Because sea levels rose gradually rather than all at once, the lowest sections of the cave were the first to disappear underwater. And a meaningful share of whatever artwork once covered those lower walls has been dissolved or worn away by seawater, long before Henri Cosquer ever arrived. What survives today sits mostly in the upper chambers, the sections that stayed above the rising waterline long enough to remain partially preserved even after the entrance itself sank below the surface. Research attention on the site actually slowed for several years after 1994, once the far more accessible Chauvet Cave was discovered in the Ardèche region and pulled funding and scientific interest toward easier fieldwork. It took until 2011 for the alarm to be raised again in earnest, when researchers Michel Olive and Luc Van Rel documented rapidly worsening damage to several images caused by accelerating sea level rise, a warning that pushed the cave's preservation back to the top of the research priority list. Continued erosion, shifting currents, and rising modern sea levels all add pressure to what remains, meaning the surviving artwork exists on borrowed time in a way that dry inland caves like Lascaux and Chauvet simply don't have to worry about. Rapidly worsening damage to several images caused by accelerating sea level rise, a warning that pushed the cave's preservation back to the top of the research priority list. Continued erosion, shifting currents, and rising modern sea levels all add pressure to what remains, meaning the surviving artwork exists on borrowed time in a way that dry inland caves like Lascaux and Chauvet simply don't have to worry about. Given how fragile the surviving art actually is, protecting it from further damage, including damage from careless visitors, became just as urgent as studying it. Part of that protection effort involved keeping certain details about the cave's structure out of public view for decades. In March 1992, researchers discovered a second entrance into the cave system, separate from the original underwater passage Cosquer had followed years earlier. Rather than announcing it, authorities chose to keep its location secret, A decision that held for more than 30 years, driven by concern that publicizing a second way in could make an already fragile site far harder to secure. Diving into the real Cosquer Cave today is not permitted for the public, and access is restricted to a small number of qualified researchers working under tight scientific supervision. French authorities and researchers, including scientific director Cyril Montoya, continue running structured research campaigns designed to study the cave without accelerating its decay, while Henri Cosquer himself later pursued a legal dispute with the Ministry of Culture, seeking compensation tied to a French law passed in 2001 that entitles the original discoverers of archaeological sites to a financial reward connected to the site's historical value. To let the public experience the cave without risking the original artwork, a detailed full-scale replica called Cosquer Méditerranée opened in Marseille on June 4, 2022, built by the same company responsible for the well-known Chauvet Cave replica further north. Visitors enter through simulated exploration pods designed to recreate the sensation of surfacing from underwater into the cave's dry chambers, before walking through a meticulously recreated version of the paintings and engravings, including a full reconstruction of the panel of horses. Researchers have also produced a complete digital scan of the cave's surviving upper sections, described by one geologist as a kind of preserved memory of a place the sea will eventually reclaim entirely, giving both the public and future scientists a way to study the site long after the real cave finally disappears beneath the water for good. Even with everything researchers have already uncovered, a long list of basic questions about this cave remains unanswered. Nobody can say for certain why marine animals appear so prominently on these walls when almost no other Ice Age cave art anywhere in Europe focuses this heavily on sea creatures. Nobody knows exactly why some visitors chose to leave hand stencils with fingers folded or missing, or what meaning that gesture actually carried for the people who made it. And nobody has explained why two separate groups of people, separated by roughly 8,000 years and working with noticeably different toolkits, both chose this same hard-to-reach cave to create their art, or whether the second group knew anything at all about the images the first group had left behind in the dark. Every detail in this story traces back to verified radiocarbon dating, calcite layer analysis, and decades of extremely difficult underwater fieldwork carried out by trained divers and archaeologists working together under genuinely dangerous conditions. What started as one diving instructor following a strange gap in an underwater rock face turned into one of the only Ice Age art sites on Earth built around seals, extinct seabirds, and a wounded man, rather than the horses and mammoths found almost everywhere else. A rising sea that could have destroyed this cave completely, instead sealed part of it in place for thousands of years, preserving a version of Ice Age life that looks nothing like what scientists expected to find before a curious diver's flashlight first cut through that darkness. If this kind of hidden history is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss the next one.